Hello, everybody, and welcome to, the session today on promoting your path from engineer to CISO. And to be honest, this is a little bit of a personal session here because I started my career many years ago, over 20 years ago in the dot-com days. I lived through the dot-com boom and the bust. And I actually started my career, as an engineer, as a developer, building applications, building various systems. And I was back then as happy as could be. I had in my mind, I thought I would never leave this job because I was happy, satisfied, content, sitting at my desk all day long in my cubicle, really, to be honest, talking to very few people other than my immediate team members and typing away at my keyboard. And over time, I got better at my job, a little bit better. And I thought, I'm never going to move into one of those management roles. I'm never going to move into a leadership role because, from what I saw back then, naively, I thought that, what does the manager actually do? The manager doesn't really do anything. Well, of course, how wrong I could have been. And what we're going to talk about here today is I want to try to share with you guys, some of the things that I've learned over the years, a lot of times by accident. Sometimes I say I was an accidental manager. I got into the CISO role a little bit on accident here, never necessarily, as I mentioned early in my career, had a plan to move into a leadership role. And come to realize that, all of the technical experience and the technical capabilities and skills that I had developed over time, those were not the things that were important, the most important thing for moving into a management role or taking on some additional management and leadership responsibilities. And some of the things that we're going to talk about, these various leadership and management skills and competencies that I'll mention here today, a lot of those things, you might look at those and you might say, well, Frank, those things are common sense. And I'll say, yeah, you're right. They are common sense. But as I learned in my journey from engineer to CISO, is that they are not always common practice. It's those technical skills that you have might get you invited to the party, right? But those technical skills and experience that you build up, those are not the things that are going to keep you at the party over time. So these are some of the things that I want to share with you here today. And of course, feel free, chime in any point in time. If you have a question, a comment, something you would like to share as well, feel free to chime in here either in the chat or the QA. I've got them both here at eye level, and we will be glancing back at them every once in a while. So moving on here to the next slide, just a quick intro for those of you that I may not have met already. My name's Frank Kim. I've been teaching, writing classes with SANS for over 15 years now, and was the CISO here for a little bit, currently lead our cloud security and our leadership curriculum, of which this content is a part. I'm also currently the CISO in residence at a venture capital firm called YL Ventures, working with various startups, CEOs, portfolio companies, founders, and so on. If you want to stay in touch, feel free to go ahead and probably the best way, my email is here, shoot me an email at any time, but the best way to stay in touch is probably through LinkedIn if you want to go ahead and connect on LinkedIn as well. Now let's go ahead and start this off by talking a little bit about the evolution of security leadership. And as I mentioned, when I started my career, I was really only thinking about the technical stuff. What do I need to do? Hands on keyboard, what code do I need to write? Systems do I need to deploy? Well, everybody, there is an organization. If you have heard of this organization called the NACD, please do go ahead and turn your attention to the chat. Just chime in with a +1, a thumbs up, a emoji of your choice indicating that you've heard about that because, side note, if some of you could do that as well, this is also, giving me some confirmation that yes, you guys could hear me because I realized, hey, I neglected to do a sound check here at the top of the hour. So Brian, thank you so much. Oh, Brian, hey, thanks. I haven't seen you in a while. Thanks for joining. Thanks for raising your hand there. If anybody else would like to chime in here, please do go ahead. Clayton, thank you for the confirmation. Appreciate it. Now, there is an organization called the NACD, and I see a number of people are chiming in. Kevin, number of other folks. Thank you very much. The National Association of Corporate Directors. And the NACD is the entity that provides guidance to board members, the senior governing body of most organizations. And, they specifically say in their cyber risk oversight guidance is, you as a board member, you need to make sure that your organization is treating security not as a IT security issue, but is treating it as a enterprise risk management issue. All right. Now I see that the chat function is disabled. Sorry about that. I didn't realize that that was the case, but glad to hear that the QA function is enabled. So please do feel free to chime in at any point in time with any questions that you have. Appreciate that feedback. And what does this mean for us? It means that we, as the modern security leader, the modern security manager, security leader, CISO, is we need to take into account the larger business context, the stuff that I had no idea about, to be honest, earlier in my career. So it's not just about the technical security activities, but it's of course about the regulatory, compliance, legal, privacy, and business related objectives. Now you'll notice on the right-hand side, it says risk management. Well, it turns out our job, early in my career, I thought my job was really just to do what? Was just to implement security controls, deploy new security tools, capabilities, and controls. Certainly, that's an important part of what we do and our teams do on a day-to-day basis, but really what we do for our organizations is to manage information risk. Our job is to manage information risk for our various organizations. And as we think about this, of course, what differentiates a cybersecurity leader from another leader in the organization? Well, what differentiates us from a HR leader, a finance leader, a business unit leader? Of course, it is the technical understanding of cybersecurity, which is why we've got the technical slice of the pyramid down here at the bottom, serving as the base. Now, the good news is the cool thing about cybersecurity is that people come into cybersecurity from many different backgrounds, very different experiences. Just because I happen to come into security as an engineer, as a developer, not in security originally, eventually moving into security, well, that's just one path. I had many colleagues over the years coming from lots of different backgrounds, philosophy majors, history majors, coming from other parts of the organization, program management, project management, from IT, from the help desk, and so on. But the common theme here is that, hey, at some point or another, whether or not you're doing it hands-on, you have to have some foundational technical knowledge about, well, how cybersecurity works, architecture, engineering, and so on. But as you progress in your career, come to find out that that becomes less and less important in the sense that you're not the one that's going to be doing that on a day-to-day basis. So as you take on more management responsibilities, as you take on more leadership responsibilities, and therefore have to interact with the executive team, have to interact with the board, the CEO, the CFO, and so on, well, it turns out that the business knowledge you need to have, well, moves up, increases as you move up this pyramid and take on different roles and responsibilities based upon, well, who you are talking to within the organization as well. So then, if I said earlier, it's not the technical capabilities that are going to get you there into those management and leadership roles. Well, then what is the difference, right? It turns out that, hey, it's about those management and leadership skills that are going to help you, well, build the team, grow the team, get the work done overall. Now, check out this table here. This is our boss, manager, leader matrix. And if anybody has seen this, you've seen something similar online, I'm going to say, and I've told people this before, that I think our version, the SANS version of this leadership matrix here is at least 50% better than the other ones that I see online. Why? Because the other ones that I see online only have two columns, the manager and the leader column. What we've added here is the boss column. Why? Well, we've added the boss column here specifically because, well, if you only have a table with two columns, manager and leader, it kind of implies that the manager is somehow somewhat lesser than the leader. And I would say that is definitely not the case. You need to have both management and leadership skills and competencies. But what we don't want to only have are the boss type of characteristics. Now, I know that you can't chime in here in the chat, but feel free, go ahead and, hey, whether you put it in the QA or you raise your hand here, I'm going to ask you a question. Have you ever had a micromanager? Have you ever worked for a micromanager, reported to one? I see Gabriel, Clayton, Adam, Kevin, Brett, Samantha. Wow, so many people. I can't even read off all of these names here as well. Abdullah looks like, right? So many people have had a micromanager. Now, it turns out that this is a common situation because what usually happens is, well, when does somebody get promoted to their first management type of role? Usually It is the senior most technical person that gets promoted to that initial management or boss type of role. And a lot of times, well, technical person gets that role and they look around and they say, wait a second, I was the best at doing this particular task, this particular job before. Now, all of the people that are reporting to me, they're not doing it so well. They're not doing it as well, as effectively, as efficiently, as knowledgeably as I used to do it just 1 week ago. And so they turn into a little bit of a micromanager. I've seen this happen a lot, especially for us as technical people when we move on. Like sometimes we have a hard job of letting things go. Side note here, when I was interviewing for my first big executive job, they knew that I had a technical background. And one of the VPs, one of the senior VPs that was interviewing me said, Frank, how much technical work do you think that you'll be able to do in this role? Now, in this particular case, it depends. It depends upon the size of the team, the size of the organization. But what do you think? I'll ask you rhetorically. What did I say? How did I respond to that question? How much technical work would I do in that particular role? Now, this was running a big team, building a big program, and so on. So I said, the amount of technical work that I'm going to be doing is 0. I will be doing 0 technical hands-on work. Now, my technical background, that's useful because, well, hey, I should know what direction the team should go in. I should be able to better understand what they're working on, resolve any conflicts that may arise, and so on. But that's the benefit of having some of that foundational technical knowledge is that, hey, you can understand, is the team moving in the right direction or not? But the boss has a hard time actually letting go. You may have heard about this syndrome called the Get Me a Rock Manager. Well, the Get Me a Rock Manager, I had a CIO once, and he told me about this. I didn't know about it. I hadn't heard about it. So I Googled it, and lo and behold, it showed up on Google search results. So I knew it was true. I knew it was a real thing. All kidding aside, right? It turns out the Get Me a Rock Manager is you got a boss who says, hey, Alejandro, please, I need you to find me this rock. It should have this mineral composition, this size, this shape, this weight, this color, these striations, and so on. So you, Alejandro, you go out and you go get him the rock and you bring the rock back. And what does the micromanager inevitably say? The micromanager says, well, Alejandro, nice try, but that wasn't the exact rock that I was looking for. And he changes up the requirements. So then you go out a second time and you go get the rock that meets those particular criteria and you bring it back. And what does the micromanager say? The micromanager says, well, Alejandro, nice try again, but that's not exactly what I was looking for. And then the micromanager starts to go look for the rock themselves. How motivating is this? I guess instead I should say, how demotivating is this, right? It's not very motivating at all because the boss is dictating, controlling what actually specifically needs to be done. Now, this doesn't mean that we don't ever exhibit some boss, quote unquote, capabilities, characteristics, if you will, because especially in an incident, in an emergency, right, you might need to be a little bit more directive. But in the modern workforce, especially the modern corporate workforce, we know that we need to take on more management and leadership type of characteristics. Now, why do these characteristics? We mentioned that these could be, hey, common sense, but not always common practice. Why do we fall into failing to implement this common practice? Well, this is where a really great book called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni comes in. Now, Patrick Lencioni nicely summarizes, well, perhaps a lot of the experiences that you guys might have had at work as well. And he basically says, why don't teams perform? Why are teams dysfunctional? If you haven't read this book, I highly suggest checking it out. It's a short, very fun read, written in story form, in fictional form. He refers to it as a leadership fable. Now, how do we know that teams are dysfunctional? Well, we know that teams aren't working when there are no results. That's the outcome that we see here at the top. But why are there no results? Well, there is the avoidance of accountability. People don't take accountability for their responsibilities, for the tasks at hand, pointing fingers at everybody else. And why do they point fingers at everybody else? Because of a lack of commitment. They don't see themselves as a team. Each person may be vying for their own power, prestige, and position in the organization itself. Now, when this happens, though, why don't people call it out? Why don't people say, hey, your motivation is selfish, so we need to think about things as a team? Why don't people say that? It's hard to say those difficult things, and it's because of a fear of conflict. I've had somebody on my team. He's been working for many years as a senior person, but he specifically says, Frank, I really don't like conflict. If there's any type of situation where there could be some conflict or disagreement, I try not to, right? I try not to engage in those situations. People are afraid, right? Because if you bring up a conflict, you bring up something that somebody doesn't agree with, well, hey, you're afraid of what might actually occur. And what is, according to Patrick Lencioni, the root of all of this? Why does this occur? Why is there a fear of conflict? It is because of an absence of trust, right? I've worked in many organizations and I've seen, especially at the senior executive levels, as these senior executives, we as a leadership, we as leaders, we have a hard time, right? Why do we have a hard time? Because we got to lead up, we got to manage across, and we got to manage down. Well, senior executives, the worst ones I've ever seen, right, only successfully lead in one direction. And that direction is up. And that is an indication of, well, to be honest, selfishness, right? They are kind of in it for themselves. And as a result, well, are their peers, are the other members on their team, the other members of the executive team, are they going to trust that person? No, because they can clearly see they're in it for themselves. So this is what Patrick Lencioni is talking about. And here on the next slide, well, what do we need to put in place to make sure that we maintain, that we build, that we create that trust with the team overall? Of course, hey, we've got honesty, but we've got integrity here as well. What does integrity mean? It's doing what you say you're going to do. Well, saying what you're going to do and doing what you say you're going to do. And if for some reason you can't do what you said, you can't make that commitment, then you need to go back and explain and talk about, well, why you weren't able to do that particular thing. Empathy, being able to, right, actually feel what the other person is going through, but contributing, rolling up your sleeves, consistency, showing up every single day, and transparency. I try, sometimes in security and in leadership roles, we can't share all of the information we might have available to us, but we try to be as transparent as possible. Why? Because, well, we want people to know as much about the situation so that they can themselves navigate in the situation so that they could eventually make decisions for themselves as well. And we talked about this fear of conflict, this absence of trust. Has anybody here read the book Radical Candor by Kim Scott? If so, please go ahead and raise your hand or chime in here in the chat. Now, Kim Scott, the reason that she wrote this book, now it comes in the form of, as you see here, I see a few people chiming in. Thank you, Luz, for that confirmation. See, it comes in the form of this awesome 4-quadrant grid. And as we know, most things in leadership come, when they're good, they come in the form of a 4-quadrant grid. But really, she came up with this little rubric here because of an experience that she had. And she specifically said had somebody on her team, and that person was not performing, was not suited for the particular job. However, he was super nice, right? He would bring cookies and he would bring candy and he would always be very nice and check in on other people. Everybody just loved him, but he could not execute on his job. Well, for Kim Scott, she said, I really, from a performance perspective, I need to do something, but she didn't, right? And let him continue for some year and a half to continue to bring cookies to the team meeting. Well, a couple years passed and the organization had some layoffs and they decided to let him go. And when she finally explained, well, why? Because it was performance related, he looked at her and said, Kim, I'm shocked to hear this. Why didn't you tell me this before? Why didn't you tell me this before? I thought we were friends. I thought we were friends. Now, wow, right? And so this led her to think about, hey, what she could have done better. And, a lot of times people don't want to, on the x-axis here, challenge directly because, people sometimes get offended. It's hard to give that direct feedback. But if you don't care on the bottom of the y-axis, that could be seen as obnoxious. But if you do balance this out with, at the top of the y-axis, caring personally, this is what Kim Scott refers to as that, yes, radical candor. And a big element of this is providing feedback. Now, I'll ask this rhetorically, right? If you've ever had a difficulty in giving feedback, right? Hey, go ahead and, virtually here, raise your hand. And what we want to do is provide you with a little rubric here. I see Gabriel, Brandon, thank you for the confirmation. Now, a lot of times, yes, it is difficult to provide feedback. Now, again, common sense, but sometimes hard to put into common practice. Brett, thank you for that confirmation. Evans, Dan here as well. And, I have these conversations with even, CISOs, senior leaders, with managers, with directors all the time. And, for me personally, right? Hey, while these things might be common sense in the heat of the moment, in the heat of the emotions get high, for me, late at night when it's close to bedtime, hey, hey, I've got these tools that I can use to even interact and talk with my kids, but I will forget about them, right? Because I'm tired, we get distracted, and so on. And as somebody here says in the Q&A, feedback is hard to give, especially providing the feedback upward, right? Because yes, that is definitely hard, because when you provide the constructive feedback upward, you're concerned, you're wondering, well, will this impact me? How will this impact me? It depends upon, well, the personality and the motivations of the person to whom you are providing feedback. But here, in terms of a little mental model that you could think about, is on the left-hand side, providing the feedback, what do? Well, you want to go ahead and start with the facts, right? You start with the facts. And a lot of times what I find is that, and we will see an example of this on the next slide, is that people will jump to the thing that needs to change. An example, I was once on the board of a nonprofit, and one of the jobs of the nonprofit is to go ahead and provide, well, basically a performance review of the CEO, of the executive director. And shortly after I joined, well, it turns out that the existing board members had put together a performance review document like we might see at work. And when I read it, it was pretty bad. It was horrible, not because of the executive director's performance per se, but because everything was personal. Everything was a personal attack. It was like, well, we had this board meeting and I didn't like how you said this and it made me feel a certain way. Well, I don't like how you did this, right? Everything was personal. So what you want to do is you want to start with the facts instead. What actually happened? And then, right, you talk about the impact. How did that impact the team? How did that impact the organization? And then you stop, you pause, you listen. And it doesn't mean that you have to get through all of this in one meeting. This might occur over maybe a couple different meetings, over multiple meetings. It's only then that you jump to the expectations. The mistake that I have made many times is that I will start at the bottom left-hand side of this slide, is I jump straight to the expectations, right? Common sense, but it's hard to put into common practice. Similarly, as you are receiving feedback, well, notice there is one common word among both sides. The listen, right? The most important part of communication, yes, is of course listening. And I find that especially as a technical person, right, that a lot of times that we technical people have a hard time, having these types of conversations. So here on the next slide is an example. So let's imagine that you're having your regular team meetings and one of the team members is always late. So here's an example of a bad way to provide some feedback is you can't just say, hey, you're always late. More effectively, you might say, start with the facts. 3 weeks in a row, you've been late to our staff meeting. This means we got to stop what we're talking about and catch you up. Impact. And as a result, it wastes other people's time and is disrespectful. But then, now you need to, remember the model, file, feedback, facts, impact, and listen. So now this is where you ask a question. Is there a reason why you haven't been able to get here on time? And stop, pause, right? And understand maybe there's some things that are going on in the commute, in the personal life, whatever it might be. So then you move on to when the time comes, those corresponding expectations, right? So simple example here, but a little mental rubric to think about the file model for providing feedback. And one of the challenges here is that why is it so hard to provide feedback? Well, we talked about the absence of trust. We talked about the fear of conflict. And somebody mentioned it's hard to provide that feedback upwards. Well, it turns out maybe somebody has read this book before. There's an FBI hostage negotiator, Chris Voss. It looks like Trevor, Ezra, some people have read this before. Never split the difference. He was one of the most successful hostage negotiators in FBI history. And when he retired, he wrote this book, right? Collating his experiences and the experiences of some of his other colleagues. He said that, in every hostage negotiation, there was a point in time where when he was talking with the hostage taker, if he got to this point in the conversation, he had a very strong belief that the hostage crisis would successfully get resolved. And that was at the point where Chris would ask the hostage taker, so what I'm hearing is, this is what you want, this is what you care about, and this is why we're here. And at that moment, if the hostage taker simply said, yes, that's when Chris knew that the negotiation would very likely be successful. Hey, it's very similar to what we just talked about. Facts, right? Hey, are you on board with these facts? Impact. Why are you doing this? Listen. Chris Voss was listening to the hostage taker. He didn't just jump straight to the expectations of, look, you really got to let these people go and you can't physically harm these people. Don't just jump straight to the expectations. Angie Morgan says, when handled effectively, successful confrontations raise team performance. To manage conflict, you got to begin by recognizing 3 sides to every story: yours, theirs, and the truth. Now, one of the other things that is hard for leaders to do, leaders of all levels, of all experience levels, sometimes is to not only communicate, resolve conflict, provide feedback, all challenges, right? Things that, well, hey, I was exposed to over the years, but it's also one of the hardest things to do is to delegate. We talked about the boss. We talked about the micromanager. And by definition, the micromanager has a hard time delegating. When you are delegating something, right? When there's no delegation, it means you are spending the most effort and the most time. But if you go ahead and manage the person and manage the task, maybe that's going to save you a little bit of time, take a little bit less effort. Ideally, you'd want to get to a point where, well, hey, you are taking the least effort and the least time in terms of giving your team autonomy to do the work and make the corresponding decisions. Now, you've got to understand here, though, that it depends, right? There's some dependencies here. I also need to know, the reason we talk about this is I need to understand, well, you need to understand, we need to understand, what is our preferred leadership style? Do we want to delegate, or we naturally try to micromanage, we naturally try to control the situation a little bit more to be able to, move work in a different way. My natural tendency is towards the bottom right here. However, I cannot just ask people to go ahead and, hey, go ahead and create the strategic plan, well, because that project is too big, right? I can't just ask an inexperienced team to do something, well, because they might need a little bit more handholding. So the approach that you take to delegation very much depends upon, well, the situation, the team, and so on. So how do you go about figuring this out? This is where it gets us to the ABCs of delegation. Now, as an example, I had somebody join the team many years ago. A new team member came in from the outside. And we talked about this during the interview process, the things that he would be working on, what team he would be joining. And well, at one point in time, one of the initial tasks, one of the initial projects was to work on a threat report for the team overall for the company. And this was an internal threat report, not publicly facing. And I said, hey, we need to update this threat report. It was done in the prior 2 years. Here are the 2 years of prior threat reports. And really, you just need to gather the data and go ahead and do an updated version of the threat report. So some time goes by, a week goes by, 2 weeks go by, a month goes by, no progress on the threat report, right? So I realized that, well, what happened? Well, what could I do potentially better? Well, maybe it was too big of a job, right? Well, so then I said, you know what? Hey, you've got to go get this data from, these 5 different teams and analyze it. Just go ahead and pick this one particular area and go get the data from this particular team, trying to break it down into its smaller bite-sized chunks. Some time goes by, a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, still no progress on the threat report. So what did I do wrong? Well, this is where the ABCs of delegation come into play. Well, when I assessed the situation, I knew that there was this task that needed to be done because we had done it in the prior 2 years. We wanted to get it updated. However, what I didn't correctly assess was the ability of that particular person. This was just not something in terms of creating a threat report, not from scratch, but, from the very beginning, this was not something that was in their wheelhouse to do. So, well, while I did correctly break the news to assign that responsibility, convey the required results, provide some resources, agree on the deadline, right? I was probably, to be honest, a little bit too hands-off. And then I also didn't communicate as frequently, perhaps, as I should have in terms of kind of that weekly check-in. And then it's not like you go through these ABCs at one time. You go back to the top, and then I should have reassessed, right? I made the wrong decision on who to assign to delegate that threat report to, right? So this is why delegation can sometimes be hard. So how do you help people to improve, to get better? Well, this is where coaching, mentoring, and sponsorship comes into play. Now, there are differences. Coaching is what? Is about helping somebody build a particular skill. In sports, you've got your shooting coach, your hitting coach, and so on, helping you to build a specific skill. Now, when I had that first big executive job that I mentioned, well, just by standard practice, one of the things that the company did was to assign every new executive an executive coach. And so I got this executive coach, and well, hey, she was there to kind of help me build skills to navigate within the organization, build relationships with the other senior leaders, and so on. Develop specific competencies. Mentoring, on the other hand here, though, is, well, hey, it's not just about coaching for a particular skill. It's usually a mutually beneficial relationship where both parties are learning from others as well. And a lot of times I've been in the fortunate situation where, I've been in a mentoring role before, and then over time that develops, and well, that other person, we become more friends and we become peers. And whenever I think about a mentoring role or a situation, I always think about, hey, 3 things before I agree to be somebody's mentor. I say, number 1, can I actually help that person? Number two, well, hey, if we talk about some things, will the person act, right? Will they actually, move forward and trying to make some progress? And number 3, right, can I learn something from that person as well? This is why mentoring is a 2-way street. Finally, this gets us to sponsorship. Now, I will ask a rhetorical question here. Who here has ever had a sponsor in your career? And we talk about coaching to build those skills. I see Michael has had a sponsor before. We talk about mentoring to build relationship. Ezra has had a sponsor. Very nice. Kevin as well. Thank you for sharing. Now, sponsors are different from coaches and mentors, right? These are usually people that are more senior in your organization, people that are a little bit more senior in the industry. And as a result, well, they want to find stellar people to work with and help people get some of these high-profile engagements, high-profile projects within your organization. Now, why would they actually do this? Why would they connect you with these key assignments? Now, I'll ask rhetorically, can your immediate manager be your sponsor? Well, yes, yeah, your immediate manager. I've had my immediate manager be my sponsor before. Now, because, well, they're trying to help connect you with some key assignments. Now, why do they want to do that? Why does anybody want to do that? Well, because you've shown through what you've been able to deliver that, hey, you can get the job done. And when you can get the job done, you understand what's valuable to the team and the organization. You've proven that your sponsor wants to connect you with these key projects because, well, you're going to, by extension, make them look good, right? So ideally, especially if you want to advance to more senior levels, well, this is where, right, you gotta find a sponsor. And sometimes, a lot of times, this is not a formal sponsorship thing where, hey, you don't go necessarily ask somebody, will you be my sponsor? It just works out in that way. I have had many sponsors over the years without formally talking about the fact that they were my sponsor, right? So, but for you, this is something to think about both for yourself and for your team members. How do you get your team members to continue to grow and improve? Coaching, mentoring, and sponsorship. Now, here on this next slide, in addition to, well, improving both yourself, your opportunities, and your team members' opportunities, another big thing that we are responsible for as cybersecurity leaders is to lead change within the organization. Now, I always say that you need to lead change at the rate at which your org can accept it. Now, we know that there are certain times, like in a post-breach environment, where you could maybe move a little bit faster. The org is a little bit more open to change, but the post-breach model doesn't always last. The FUD, the fear, uncertainty, and doubt approach doesn't always last. And this is why you've got to think about, how do you build a security-aware and a risk-aware sustainable culture? How do you build this risk-aware culture? And I've seen many security teams over the years kind of slowly disintegrate because the CISO leaves, some key people leave, and as a result, right, the security capabilities slowly start to degrade. This is an indication that there is not a sustainable culture that was built. So how do you go about doing this? People will only change if they know that there is some benefit to them and they see the corresponding benefit to them. People might have a high motivation to stay secure, but on the x-axis here, their ability might be relatively low. Let me give you a personal example. Let's say that I have a goal, the desire to get into better shape. And every morning when I wake up, I want to do 50 push-ups. So my motivation might be high. However, my ability might be very low because I actually maybe can't do 50 push-ups. So what can I do? What can I do to increase my ability? Well, to start, maybe I don't have a goal of doing 50 push-ups. Maybe I do 5 push-ups instead, right? So you can see both my motivation is high and my ability is high. And that means that I'm very much more likely to get this thing done of trying to get into better shape. However, what else happens? well, I might have a goal to do those 5 push-ups every morning as soon as I get up. But when I wake up, what happens? Well, I'm tired, it's a little cold, my phone is right next to me, I pick up my phone and I start scrolling through and I get distracted. So I could increase my ability by putting the phone in a different room. And then I might go ahead and remind myself, have a sign on the door, sign other things to prompt me, to remind me to do, right, those 5 push-ups as I'm moving forward. Similarly, right, there's a company that does an amazing job of getting us to do the things that they want. Maybe you know who I'm referring to. It is Facebook, right? What is Facebook's goal? Facebook's goal is to try to drive as much engagement on their website, their mobile app as possible. Well, you might have a motivation, right, to catch up with your friends, see the latest news, to see your family photos, and so on. And so Facebook makes it as easy as possible, right, increasing your ability. They say, hey, they have a mobile app, they have a website, they make it as convenient as possible for you to access Facebook. But just because you have high motivation and ability doesn't mean that you're always going to do it. So what else does Facebook do? They remind you, they prompt you all the time. Push notifications, reminder emails, and so on. Hey, come back and see all of the amazing things your friends and family are doing on Facebook. This is the type of thing that we want to remind ourselves and think about as we are trying to introduce behavior change in our organizations. All right, now, related to this driving change is related to, well, what do people get out of it? What is their corresponding motivation? And I see, Ludwig, you've got a comment here, and I'm going to circle back to that here at the very end here. So Ludwig, if you could just wait on that very good question here. We've got a slide that is related to that at the very end here. Now, John Hubbard, right? A friend, fellow SANS instructor here who teaches our SOC leadership course and our security analysis course. He came across this research that talks about the human capital model. And when he shared it with me, I was kind of blown away because it's so succinctly summarized kind of what we do from a management and leadership perspective. Now, there was a group of researchers that decided that they wanted to learn more about how security can successfully work. So they did a very interesting thing, is they actually went and got a job in a SOC. And they worked in a SOC for 6 months, Security Operations Center. And they observed, right, what worked and what didn't actually work. And they came up with this model that they called the human capital model. And they said, you know what, when people are empowered, remember that boss, manager, leader that we talked about? That leads to increased creativity, which leads to increased growth, which leads to increased skills, which further leads to increased empowerment. All right, so now keep this in mind, because moving on to the next slide on the lower left-hand corner, we've got that human capital cycle that we just talked about. But as people are improving, getting better, right, as you are investing in them, maybe via coaching, mentoring, or sponsorship, and as this improves, well, this leads to some self-reflection, which in the SOC world leads to, well, automation, maybe in terms of your playbooks, your SOAR, your security orchestration, automation, and response, which leads to operational efficiency on the far right-hand side, which then leads to, well, corresponding metrics. And metrics will then lead to improved perceptions from leadership, which then leads to increased resources like additional budget. And when you have more resources, you can invest those back into growing the team. Now, while this study was conducted primarily, specifically based on some research within the SOC, I think hopefully you can see how we can, well, broaden this to be applicable to everything that we do from an overall security leadership perspective. Right? And so we talk about this here because, hey, how do you get better? It's not just about investing in your team, turning that common sense into common practice to increase the lower left-hand cycle here, that human capital cycle, but it's also, well, understanding what is the bigger picture. What is the larger plan? One of the biggest goals that you should have as a manager and a leader is to understand, well, what is the plan for security? What is your multi-year roadmap? And how does that tie back to, well, your strategic objectives for your organization overall? Now, Kevin specifically points out is one of the things that you are responsible for is to improve your cybersecurity culture in the company. It's proving to be very difficult, right? So yes, very challenging. Now, I will ask you, how many years does it take to shift culture in an organization? Depends upon the size, right? But it takes anywhere from, roughly speaking, 3 to 7 years to shift culture in an organization, Kevin. So one thing is, hey, I'm not sure how many years you are into this, but realize that it's going to take a long time. Why? Because culture will only change when right? People see some new behavior, some new actions, and will only change when there is corresponding benefit, when they see that there is a corresponding benefit to those changed actions. I mention this all the time. I had a CISO once. He came into a new organization and he looked around and he said, I don't like it here. I want to go ahead and we're going to do everything we can to change the culture of our organization to make it more like a financial institution, a financial company. Well, what do you think happened to that CISO? Well, that CISO didn't last very long because the organizational antibodies started attacking him immediately, right? So Kevin, yes, long story short is that you want to do, right? You want to focus more on those common sense to common practice things, and slowly over time, one big element of that, of moving your organization in a certain direction to have an improved culture is to, yes, have a strategic plan that says, look, what is your security mission and vision? I just chaired a CISO bootcamp a couple of weeks ago, and we had CISOs from all different types of organizations. And I was surprised actually to find that a common theme in all their presentations was when we started our program, we started by creating a security mission and vision that was aligned to the objectives of the organization as a whole. So that's exactly what we're talking about here is you've got to create a plan that your team knows, your team buys into, and share it, communicate about it over and over and over and over again. And yes, Kevin, it's going to be a long haul to influence and inform that culture because, well, hey, 3 to 7 years. Now, side note, what is the average tenure of a CISO that we see from various industry surveys and industry reports? The average tenure of a CISO is only anywhere from 1.5 to 2 years. So do you see that? Do you see that disconnect there, right? And so this is why, right, you want to build, invest in that sustainable culture there, aligned with your strategic plan overall. Now, how do we know directionally where our strategic plan should be going? Well, this is where now we're turning away from some of those common sense to common practice things to some things that are a little bit more security specific in terms of understanding here on the bottom part of this chart is what are the investments that your organization, your business has had to make in technology over the years. For example, the first website, wireless network, mobile devices, big data, cloud computing, and now, of course, the topic that is on everybody's mind, AI, artificial intelligence. What do we need to understand to secure it, to enable it? We are still in the early days of that. The main point here of this slide is that your business has had to make investments in technology over the years to enable various business outcomes, not for the sake of technology itself, but by adopting these new technologies, well, there is an increasing operational risk that occurs. What else has happened over time? Well, the threat landscape has changed drastically from basic threats to hacktivists to organized crime to advanced persistent threat and so on. So the threat landscape is changing, and we see over time in the upper right-hand corner, there is a widening gap between the threat landscape and, well, the controls that you might have in your organization to deal with those things. So both the business, the technology, and the threat landscape is changing on a regular basis. This is why we need to provide some, well, structure to our security team, provide some structure to our strategic plan. Most commonly, we see this in the form of using something like the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, the CSF. I mentioned at the beginning of the session today that, hey, the NACD, right? They have this cyber risk oversight document, and they say, hey, you not only should be treating security not as an IT issue, but as an enterprise risk management issue, but they also tell boards of directors, well, hey, you as a board should be asking your leadership, well, what is our security program doing? And are we using an industry recognized framework like the NIST CSF? They don't say just use the CSF, but they ask, are you using one like the CSF? And why does this even come up? Well, because it helps senior leaders understand security in a way that is simple, right? Look at on the left-hand side. These 5 functions really aggregate what it is every one of our security teams do. We identify bad stuff, we identify our assets, we protect, right, or prevent bad things from occurring, we detect things that occur if it gets by our protective capabilities, and we respond and recover to it. So it helps from a process perspective us to define and talk about what we're doing, how we're doing, what we want to do, and where we actually want to get to. Now, Jeremy has a really good question, is what do you do when you realize you tried to implement your vision too fast for your team to adjust to? Very excellent question. And I think, Jeremy, you know the answer is, well, you need to change gears. You need to tap on the brakes a little bit. It's been said many times, hey, you don't have brakes in the car to go slower. You have brakes on the car to go faster, right? To do so in a safe manner. Well, a couple examples, back to your question, Jeremy, is that I've got a friend who I used to work with. And we, in this company, we put together a very good strategic plan. And, he moved to a different company. And he said, you know what? Man, things are moving a little slow. I want to make some progress. Hey, as a new leader in a company, you want to make as much progress as quickly as possible. So what he did is he took the strategic plan that we had at the prior company and effectively dropped it into the new company. And what do you think happened? Well, it didn't work, right? It wasn't tailor-made for that particular organization. So there was resistance, right? And speaking of that resistance, I've made the same mistake myself. Years ago, I came up with, in retrospect, what is arguably a very good, right? Appropriate, arguably amazing strategic plan. Got extra funding for it, right? And we got extra buy-in, and then it got approved. And then what did I do? I took it to the team. And I said, hey guys, we got a 30% increase in budget. And over this time, these are the things that we're going to do. Well, Jeremy, what do you think happened? I shared the plan with the team. Nobody wanted to work on it. They said, well, gee, so what, right? So what that we got 30% more? What does it mean for me? Does that mean I'm going to have to do 30% more work? So yeah, Jeremy, related to what you said, my guess maybe, right, is that, hey, what did I do wrong in that particular case? Well, I didn't get the team's input. I didn't get the team's buy-in. The team didn't participate in the creation of the plan itself, right? So no matter how good your approach is, right, this still gets us back to those common sense to common practice things. That file model, the feedback at a macro level, I didn't get the team's feedback. So you're going to need to adjust and balance that with, well, what does senior leadership want in terms of the overall plan itself? Now, how do you make this a little bit more concrete? Now, Alex has a very good question, is how do you fight? So Jeremy, hopefully that helped. Feel free to chime in again. Alex mentions, how do you fight the management perception that all these acronyms, AI, ML, will fix everything without human involvement, right? You're quite convinced that if the foundation is not in good shape, AI and ML would change nothing. That is exactly correct. And actually, that's perfectly timed here, Alex, because that is related to what we're going to talk about right now. We just mentioned the NIST cybersecurity framework. And you can see at the top of the x-axis here, at the top of the table, we've got those 5 NIST CSF functions. Now, this is specifically the cyber defense matrix. Maybe you've seen this before, created by a friend of mine, Sunil Yu. And he married, you can see, the 5 functions of the NIST CSF, identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, with the asset classes on the left-hand side, devices, applications, network data, and users. And we'll see a specific example of this here on the next slide. But his simple but keen insight here is that, hey, we want to make sure that we do each of these 5 things for our different asset classes. And oh, by the way, it turns out, as Alex is pointing out, that it's not just about doing those things. It's about understanding where we need to balance people, process, and technology. People, process, and technology. And it turns out that the further left of boom, further left of detect, something actually happens, it typically relies more on technology, whereas stuff to the right, like respond and recover, are typically more people-centric approaches. But notice at the bottom, process is equally cross-cutting. I've deployed many tools over the years, and some of the tools that have been the biggest failures have been the ones where we buy it, we think it's great, and it just sits on the shelf because we haven't defined the appropriate process of how it will be used within the organization. Now, just like we see here in these early days of AI, what are people using it for? Turns out it's not so much necessarily that it will be used to replace a skilled worker. It wouldn't necessarily replace a writer or an analyst or a security analyst, but it could augment, right, what the writer and the analyst are actually doing. And we talk about the cyber defense matrix here because one example of what you could do with it is you can go ahead and map out what are all of the capabilities that you've got in your team today. And you might say, hey, under protect, in terms of protecting networks, you might have a next generation firewall, an IDS and IPS, secure web gateway, some sort of internal segmentation, zero trust network access, a whole slew of acronyms. And I think, Alex, to your point, it's not about how many acronyms that you have, but it's about the capabilities, right? What are the capabilities that are enabled, right, for people, process, and technology across each of these? And for you, as the security leader, will understand where you might have a gap. Do you have a gap? Do you have more white space in some of these areas? Now notice, where is there the white space today? Well, the white space is more so in the respond and recover. And that's because it tends to be harder to create products, to create technology for these things that have traditionally been more people-centric here. But yes, you could use the cyber defense matrix to, yes, go back and map out, well, hey, where are you? Where are you invested? Where do you have capabilities? Or where might you need to think about building out additional capabilities? And then this gets us back to the bigger picture, the higher level picture. Once you do all of that, then you can say, how are we doing for each of these 5 functions? How are we doing today? The dark shade of blue. Where might we want to get to in the future? Many years ago, I had a meeting with my CFO, and my selfish reason for having that meeting was to slowly, eventually, over time, get her buy-in on a new business case and to increase the investment for the security program. And, I was just too obvious, apparently, right? But about 5 minutes into the meeting, she stops me and she says, Frank, we get it. But we know cybersecurity is important in finance, but we want to know, are we spending too much? Are we spending too little? How are we spending? What are we doing in comparison to our industry peers? She was asking specifically for what we see here is the yellow line. She was asking, how do we compare to others, right? Are we specifically going to choose to invest more in, let's say, detection capabilities and get to industry leading, level 4 out of 5? Or are we specifically going to choose to maybe not invest so much, like in this example, get to point level 2.5 for the identify function? But this is what leadership wants to know in terms of your overall plan. If you don't have a slide like this for your team, yes, you definitely have to have something like this suggestion. Go back and create something like this, because it shows in one slide, well, many of the things that senior leadership wants to know. How are we doing? Current state. Where do we want to get to? Target state. How do we compare to others? And really, so Ezra has a question. What is the source of this slide? The source of this slide is the SANS Management 514 class that I'm the author of. Side note here, there is also these a number of templates. Some of the ones that we've talked about here today are also available at a Google Drive online, freely downloadable at mgt514.com. If you go to mgt514.com, it will redirect you to a Google Drive folder that contains various PowerPoint templates, including, right, the bar graph that we saw on the prior slide. Now, this gets us to the end here, finally, right? What does this mean? Why do we talk about all this stuff? Because for you, as a leader, whether you have an existing team or whether you're joining a new team or a new organization, well, what you want to do is think about your 30, 60, 90-day plan. And what are you going to do first, second, and third? It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get all of this done within 30 days. It's more of a directional tool here to say, hey, what are you going to do first, second, and third, and what do you need to focus on? Now, I like to divide this up into both what do you do from an executive senior leadership perspective, what do you do for your team, and what do you do for yourself? Now, to be honest, the stuff at the bottom here, these are not necessarily things that you're going to go ahead and share with senior leadership. What senior leadership wants to know is, do you have a plan for a plan? How are you going to gather information, meet with stakeholders, understand the culture, develop your roadmap, use an industry standard framework, develop your business case, have corresponding metrics. And then for your team, right, you need to understand their goals from a coaching, mentoring, and sponsorship perspective. Now, Brett here has a question. In spite of having great rapport within your organization, it's difficult for users to not think you're the big brother, right? That security is actually watching them. For example, with MDM, with mobile device management, people have a difficult time understanding what happens. Now, related back to that whole behavior model, Brett, one of the challenges there is that we in security, we tell people what to do all the time. And when we tell people what to do, we say, look, we're going to deploy a new MDM solution. We're going to deploy a new endpoint solution. How much choice are we giving them? Basically, when we tell them we're going to do something, we're giving them zero choice. Now, do people like to be told what to do? No. When my 3-year-old, when we're getting ready for school in the morning, right? And I feel rushed because I need to drop him off and get back and jump on a meeting. And I'm trying to get him to hurry up. But of course, that doesn't work, right? So I hurry up, put on your shoes. Well, people don't like to be told what to do. So it makes the conversation just a little easier if I say, hey, come on, let's go. Let's put on your green shoe. Do you want to put on your green shoes or your blue shoes, right? And when you frame it like that, give somebody a choice, well, it makes it just a little bit easier. Now, hey, Brett, that's not going to solve all your problems, but if you take that approach, I've seen many security teams say, look, you can have access to the network, to the corporate network, but via the MDM, we need to keep track of, hey, is your device up to date? And you know what? If your device isn't up to date, you can still have access to the network, but it's the guest network. So at least you can still access the internet. So that's maybe a basic example, but at least it's some level of choice. So anytime there's a decision to be made, think about, well, what choice can you potentially give? Can you potentially give your stakeholders? Now, finally, this gets us back to Ludwig's question here, is that Ludwig has seen many advertisements for both CISO and CTO certifications. And these are geared towards different levels of experience and different specialties like audit and so on. So, for us here at SANS, we specifically try to focus on, well, hey, the things that we offer. A lot of times I've gotten a similar question, Frank, hey, what's the one class or cert that I could take to become a CISO, to become that modern security leader? And well, hopefully you've gotten a sense that, it's not just one thing to be that senior security leader, that modern security leader. We really think it's a combination of various things to become, on the left-hand side, that transformational cybersecurity leader and that operational security executive. From a transformational perspective, of course, as we talked about with the pyramid, is you've got to understand, well, technology, the foundation of that pyramid, but you also need to understand, well, how do you drive strategy forward? How do you build that sustainable culture that we were talking about? But you also need to understand, how do you run your security operations in terms of managing vulnerabilities, in terms of implementing various controls, and in terms of building that mature security operational capability. And so we think that these two kind of approaches here, both transformational and operational, that's what a modern security leader needs to have based upon these 6 different areas here that we're talking about in these leadership triads. So Ludwig, hopefully that answers your question there. We got a link down here at the bottom of the page that takes you to a SANS page about these triads, talking a little bit more about that here as well. And in closing here, right, before I glance back and see if there's other comments and questions, just want to point out that, hey, this is what we're talking about here is part of the SANS Cybersecurity Leadership Curriculum. We've got a class 512, Security Leadership Essentials. I'm the author for that. 514 on Strategic Planning. I'm the author for that class as well. We've got 516, Building Vulnerability Management Program. 521, Building a Security Culture. 551, right, Building Your SOC. 566, Implementing Controls. 507, Audit Class. 523, Legal. All the way on down to the right-hand side. I will highlight a newer class here. We've got 553, which is being expanded to a 5-day version. That's all about cyber incident management, a topic that we as leaders get pulled into on a regular basis. Now, with that being said, this brings us to the very last slide here. We started, right, with an intro slide, so we'll end with another one here. Feel free to go ahead and reach out anytime. Hopefully you found this valuable. If there are any other last-minute questions, feel free to chime in. Feel free to go ahead and reach out at any point in time, and look forward to connecting, ideally here on LinkedIn. Feel free to go ahead and send me a connection request. Olumwunmi, thank you so much for the feedback, and appreciate it. I'm glad you enjoyed the session. Well, for everybody else, thank you very much. This brings us to the end of the time. The slides are going to be available on the SANS portal here in the where you used to sign up. The slides will be available to download as well. All right, so thank you guys for the feedback. Ezra, Kevin, Sean, thank you so much. George, thanks for the feedback. Janelle, thank you very much as well. Hey, look forward to staying in touch and hopefully maybe see you guys in real life at some point in the future as well. Thank you very much. Thanks for taking the time. Have a good day and take care, everybody.